With ProQuest Vegas kicking off this weekend, we need to start talking about what the expected metagame is going to be. A disclaimer, of course, this is just one guy's opinion, and I have been very wrong in the past, and it's likely to happen again in the future. So take what I say with a grain of salt and compare it to your own experiences playing the format and what you think is working well and what isn't. And then another thing too, I'm kind of breaking this down into very simplistic categories. To some degree, I'm oversimplifying this, but if I were to convey this information, I think the easiest way for me to talk about it is, what do I expect to do well and what do I expect to not do well? And I think that kind of streamlines a lot of the testing process and picking a deck for the tournament season. I think if you're going to split hairs over what is a C or a D tier deck in this format, I don't really think you're getting the bigger picture, which is which deck should I play at a ProQuest and which deck do I think is like not worth picking up? Because you can identify decks that you think will be very powerful, decks that you expect to be well represented, decks you think will be in the top cut, and what you're likely to play against. So to me, I'm not going to make a huge tier list to give you a robust understanding of all the intricacies of all these different decks in the format. That's not what this video is about. This video is just simply a competitive player's perspective over what do I think would help you qualify for the Pro Tour. At the end of the day, we all have different motivations for why we attend these events. Mine personally is that I would like to qualify for, the tier 4 events. So that way I'm able to attend with all my friends, my locals, catch up with people. And that's the lens I'm viewing it through today. So it's going to be a little bit more competitive, and we're going to write off a lot of heroes, and we're going to be kind of mean. And that's just how it's going to be today. To kick this off, I think that we need to establish what the pillars are. And I think that we see two particular archetypes going on. We see decks that I think end the game in 2 turns, and decks that want to prolong the game more than 2 turns and just kind of extract value. But this is very apparent in decks like the Great Axe Warriors and Guardian. And then on the flip side, the decks are trying to end the game in 2 turns. This would be very easily categorized by decks like Briar or Kano. Decks that are very capable of presenting lethal in the first couple turns of the game if you give them the room to do this. And if I had to give an edge to one of these, I think that the aggro potential of the decks in the format is kind of outclassing the defensive capabilities of other decks. And so to kick us off, you are very likely to win if you are, I would say, playing Kano or playing Briar. These are 2 decks I think are both very strong picks. They're able to present very fast linear aggression. And if your opponent isn't well equipped to deal with it, or if they just have a poor draw sequence in the first couple turns and your deck is relatively functional, I think you're very likely to win the game. And another thing too is I'm kind of assuming that you are playing these decks at high proficiency. So I think that Kano is a relatively difficult deck to play, but when I put him in the likely to win category, I'm assuming that you have played and practiced enough to be familiar with the deck. That way you're able to, execute your game plan pretty consistently. And then to sort of round out our other pillar of the format, it would be something like the Great Axe Warrior decks. I think that Dorinthia, to me, feels like the strongest one, so I'm going to put her in the higher category just because I think that having access to bolters helps you fix a few of the issues that the deck can run into when it's playing against these aggro matchups, and specifically when it's put going second. And so I kind of view her as the stronger contender of all the Great Axe builds, but I think that all the Great Axe builds are kind of equally strong. So this tier list is going to become a mess because Great Axe itself feels more like an archetype rather than a particular hero. This will also be very apparent when we talk about the Guardians, because I think that you can basically build the exact same 55 card list for most Guardians, and it'll probably perform at the same level. But I think just for the sake of clarity of establishing what I think that the best decks in the format are, it's going to be a little bit easier just to put her in her own tier. And so I think from here we can start just firing off in alphabetical order from the heroes. I think that all of the Arachnes are just not really that competitively viable. I think that you could maybe build Huntsman in a more fatigue-orientated way in order to target Briar. But I think that ultimately these decks lack some of the disruptive power that comes in CC. A lot of the power of Assassin is gated behind the Majestics and outside of a very particular macro strategy. I don't really think that they have the turn-to-turn value or damage rates to keep up with what a larger field will be doing. I think that you could build them in a way to hyper-target something in the meta, and maybe you would be able to have some success, but I wouldn't even expect it to be overwhelming success. It would just be probably something that would be slightly favored. And then I think that if you pair into a random, hero at the event, I think that you're going to struggle a lot in those matchups. Aurora, I think, is a little bit worse than Briar, but still possesses a lot of the same card pool. I think her biggest issue is the fact that she is required to use blues, which I think puts her at a strict disadvantage compared to a deck that is able to simply resolve all of its cards without pitching. I think that's probably one of the best parts about Briar. And so I have to give the edge, but I still think that Aurora possesses the same power of the card pool that Briar does. Azalea continues to disappoint me in terms of competitive results, but I still think she has the offensive output to spike a tournament. Like, once again, we're just talking about the ability to maybe go 4-2 in Swiss, or even 3-2 at a 5-round event, and then just winning out the next 3 rounds. So I think that Azalea could be capable of such a feat, but to me, she's really kind of blending in between those final 2 categories. I just really think she's lacking a lot right now. Benji, I don't think is that good. You can compare it to Ira, and there's some small niche advantages, but once again, we're talking about the best of the best, and what do I think you will be able to qualify for the Pro Tour with, and Benji is not cutting it to me. Betsy is difficult because once again, the Guardian card pool is good enough that you could build her with all the 4 blocks and a hammer and build her exactly the same way that you would build Oldhim basically. And you probably could have some success. So I'm kind of having to skew this a little bit, but I think if you were to build more to her actual hero text, I don't really think it's that competitive. I tried Bolton again and still have the same issues where he is a little bit clunky. He doesn't have a very good weapon in Sage. And if you trip up on the first couple turns against some of these very explosive aggro decks, you are simply buried in the dirt. And we just cannot have that at a tournament circuit like this. The OG Bravo, once again, assuming that we build him more for the hero text and not putting these same 55 cards in the deck, I don't think is very good. I think you can have strictly better success with the other Guardians, including Flattering Showman, who I think is very likely to win a ProQuest. I think that if you bring this deck, you are putting yourself at pretty good odds if you were to play one of the Guardians. I think that Oldhim has been struggling a lot, and that could be because he's being built more defensively, whereas Bravo is able to play a little bit more proactive disruption. And I think that this can kind of be the difference in a few matchups where Oldhim would naturally struggle, where decks are trying to prey on him because he's such a slow deck. Bravo is able to leverage extra damage as well as evasive damage in a format which has no D-reacts, basically. And so I think that puts him at a very strong contender for the overall Guardian class. Syndra, despite having the new arms, I still think lacks what she needs to do in order to function properly. And Fi, I think, is a better deck. And even Fi is struggling to have tournament success. And so I think just by nature, she's not going to make the cut. To speed things up here, I think both of the dashes are not very strong. I think that dash IE, you could potentially win an event just because she has good raw numbers. So maybe we could put her in this category just for the sake of putting one of the mech heroes there, but I think that she is definitely on the lower end, and I'm not super optimistic about bringing her to a tournament. Aggro decks that just don't pitch for cards or have higher explosive outputs and better on hits will just outclass her every single time. A Data Doll is not worth talking about. 3 Intellect is not what you want to play. Now we talk about Dromai, and Dromai, I at least will give her this. I think that it could happen. I think that there will be some on the leaderboard for the season. But overall, I'm not very optimistic on this deck. I think it has a very bad Briar matchup, and I think that if it pairs into any Guardians that know what they're doing in the matchup, it's very trivial for them. If you play the matchup simply popping dragons, pitching poppers when you're able to for second cycle, because that's when they would actually try to pitch a particular combo turn against you, and just blocking damage, sending your hammer at an ally every turn, there's like basically nothing that the Dromai can do. I practice this matchup a lot, and it feels very deterministic. And I even practice this with Oldhim, just for the sake of giving Dromai what I think is the easiest matchup possible, because Oldhim has so many non-poppers in the deck. But even then, it's super easy just to pop a dragon when you're able to. If they don't present extra dragons, you can simply pitch a popper, send the hammer at an ally. You now have a popper in your pitch stack for when they're going to try to do like a powerful Chromai or Mirror Guy turn, and you just simply shut the door on them. Enigma is doing very well. She's having some tournament success, and I think that if you bring her to a field that is relatively unprepared, I think you're going to have a high likelihood of success. You're able to catch Briars off guard by fatiguing them. You have the ability to beat Kanos that are unfamiliar with how they should be pitch stacking into your combo turn. And I think that your DGA and Guardian matchup is incredibly good for you. And so I think that if you're bringing this to your local ProQuest, I think that you are setting yourself up for success. However, I do think she has a bad KO matchup, and that is something to keep in mind, as well as more experienced players might be able to find angles with Briar and Kano to try to get over your defenses. I think that Fi is ultimately a worse aggro deck than something like Kano or Briar, but it still has enough explosive output that I think that you would be able to find some tournament success with him, but just not as consistent as the other decks above. Now we're going to fire off a bunch of heroes here. Fang, I don't think has the consistency. It takes too long for him to get online. The fact that he has the same quest time in Sage as he does in CC makes this a very difficult hero to get rolling. Florian, I just am not seeing it. I think that even though I cover this here on the channel, and I think it has an incredible DGA and Guardian matchup, the matchups into all the other decks I think are very bad. I think KO, Enigma, Kano, and Briar are all very bad for you, and you just cannot be playing a deck that folds to all of those in the hopes that you will pair against DGA and Guardian all day. And so while I think that he could win an event, I'm putting him in the probably not, because that would require him to play into top cuts where he dodges all of those matchups. And so that's where I think things get hard, because I expect you have to play against a couple of these different heroes in the likely to win category. and he's really bad into most of them. And so I just don't think he's going to have the same kind of consistency to clutch it out and win the event. I think that you could top 8 with this hero pretty easily, though. Gravy just doesn't have it, too slow, just gets run over by the aggro decks, and I think is just lacking a little bit of explosive potential, or potentially more defenses, I think could also be the issue with this hero in this format. Ira continues to have pretty bad tournament results, but is still consistent enough that I think that you could potentially have success with her. Icelander for the same reason. I think that you can have an okay Briar matchup, and I think that you can find some angles into the slower decks, but I think it's more dicey against the Great Axe builds. I think that Enigma is naturally a predator for you, and I'm pretty much unfamiliar with the Kano matchup. That would be something I would need to test, and I could potentially see her doing well if you figure out a way to beat Kano. Grabbing the warriors, once again, we are assuming that you are building them like their hero cares about the cards in your deck, and you are not just putting DGA in here. If you put DGA in any warrior, it's instantly a good deck. But I am once again going to assume that we are going to put, 2 sabers on the table with Kasai, and we are going to play Blade Runner, and we're actually going to play with the hero and the card pool. I think that those versions of the deck I think are much worse, and I don't think that you would have a very good time with them. I think that they're just a little bit too slow and a little bit too fair. I think that ultimately, if you played against a DGA deck, they would wipe the floor with you because all their numbers would be better. So once again, DGA, I think, should just deserve its own spot. Like, it should just be its own icon to go on the tier list, but it is what it is. Katsu, it just doesn't have the explosive potential and has a lot of consistency issues. You have to once again remember that Kano and Briar will actually end the game in 2 turns. So for a deck that requires a certain combination of cards to be drawn in a certain order for the deck to function properly, in addition to having its curve work out fine where it draws exactly 1 blue and not 2 blues, and definitely not 4 reds, those kinds of decks I just don't think have the consistency to work in this format until, maybe something like Kano or Briar rotated out, and the height to ride almost in this format lowers a little bit. I think these decks have a very big task, and they're not equipped for the job currently. Captain, we're not going to talk about this. KO definitely is likely to win. I think that it's a very strong deck and has a pretty good overall matchup spread. The hard matchup for this deck is definitely Briar, which is very questionable considering how popular I expect Briar to be and how good this deck is, but nonetheless, it has a pretty good matchup spread and very good numbers. The OG KO is not worth talking about. I guess if you rolled 6s all day, then you're always going to be likely to win. RKO, I still think is in the probably not category. It just doesn't really seem to have a very good matchup into anything in the top spread. Maybe you could argue it has a good Kano matchup, but I think everything else it slightly struggles into, which is a bummer to me because I think that this deck is very cool. Levi, I think, has very good aggro output, and so this is kind of the hard one for me because if she's able to get the ball rolling very early, she's able to actually pressure a lot of damage and keep up with the aggro decks. But the problem for me is that if your opponent doesn't let you fill your graveyard on turn 0, and then they Arsenal pass, and then they fire off a 5-card hand looking at you, Briar, I think that you're kind of cooked. And so I just don't really see how this deck can compete right now. I think it can in the future, and she seems very strong. But just looking at this today, if I were to go to my ProQuest, do I think that if I brought Levi, I would have a good chance of winning? The answer is probably not. However, with Lexi, I think it might happen because I think that Lexi has the same card pool as Briar with the lightning cards, but still has access to that Death Dealer snapshot combo, but then also gets the Frostbite taxing of the ice card pool. And something as simple as firing off a bunch of attacks and then ending your turn with Red Arctic Incarceration can basically hose a ton of decks in this format that have already priced themselves into taking damage for their hand. I think that she has a very strong contention, but I don't think she's as consistent or as powerful as the heroes in the top cut. But if there ever was a hero that I think is right on the cusp of it, it's probably her. Lyeth, I don't think has it in the format. It's just a little bit too slow to get going. Marlin lacks some consistency that the other Rangers have. Max doesn't really have the power output or the on hits or the aggression to really keep up with the faster decks in the format, and into the slower deck still has the same issue running into fatigue. New has been on a little bit of a breakout this weekend. Tao Tao did very well. I think that I have to at least put her in It Might Happen because of that. I think that you can build her in a way where you are targeting the Guardians, where you are targeting Briar specifically. I would need to see more about the Kano matchup to see if there's a way to kind of solve it and what the Enigma matchup is like. But in regards to her, I view her as kind of like an X Factor style deck. Oldham I still think is perfectly fine as a pick, but he's definitely not in that top category. I think he's struggling a lot into Kano, as well as the DGA decks are just rinsing him, and Enigma is also a terrible matchup, and KO isn't good either. But if you just hit Briars all day, he's doing very well. Olympia, I guess I have to view him as DGA, so I guess I'm breaking my own rule here. I think he's a perfectly capable hero if you build him as DGA, because he at least edges out the other warriors having the Temper 2 headpiece. Acilio, I still haven't seen enough from this deck to really comment on it, but from what I remember previously, it was very, very bad. I have at least tinkered a little bit with the deck, but I haven't practiced it enough. And so this is something where, I could be very wrong on this one. Pleiades could play a standard 55 4-card block deck, but assuming that, we're playing her kind of normally, I just don't think she has what it takes. Prism lacks any sort of go again conversion, which is a pretty big deal for this format, and I think it's just why Enigma is doing so well. Puffin just doesn't have what it takes, unfortunately, and just very inconsistent right now. It doesn't have the explosive potential compared to the other aggro decks. Rhinar with Medax, I think, is definitely a meta contender, though. I think you're able to prey on some of the slower decks, and I think you can have the ability to spike the aggro decks if you draw hot, so I definitely have to put him as a meta contender here. Riptide, I just don't think has the traps necessary to handle the top decks. I think that you obviously can build him to be more aggressive, but I think that ultimately that build suffers, and so you have to place some of the traps to try to target some things. Right now, though, there's just not really much that his trap pool is really getting him. If you're going to be pairing against things, like Kano or the DGA style decks, it's just very hard for me to kind of see how this deck could have a successful tournament run, but I do think that your Enigma matchup is probably good, and I could see you potentially coin flipping against Briar, so I guess we'll put it in the might happen category. Moving on to Scurv here, I do not believe in Scurv at all. I try to really make this deck work. With the Nimby ban, I think he just lost too much. He's not really able to exploit a whole lot with the Rum package in the deck. Teklovasin, despite having the new upgrades, I still think it's just not a meta contender for now. Terra, I think, is probably one of the better Guardians. Getting an actual hero text that just gives you +1, I think, is more relevant right now because you need to be pushing a lot of disruption. And so if there was an elemental Guardian that I think is going to edge out a little bit, it might be him because of the DGA matchup. I think that between him and Oldhim, I think that his DGA matchup is probably just a little bit better. Tough Nut doesn't got it. I'm sorry. And if we move on to Azuri, I don't think she has it either. Just, lacking a lot of what makes the hero work in this format. Although I think, though, is a very good pick. Having 21 health, I think actually puts her maybe potentially above all the Guardians in the it might happen category. I mean, 21 health actually might put her in this middle category over the other Guardians, because I think that ultimately that kind of thing ends up mattering in a format that's so numbers focused. Verdance needs a little bit more support in this format to bring her up to the same power level that she's at in CC. She's just very slow and a little bit clunky. Victor is kind of fallen off the face of the earth a little bit, which is pretty surprising, but he only has one real gold generator in this format with Testa Strength. I guess I could potentially see this happening, but once again, the Guardians can only be so bad, but I guess I would have to put him down in this bottom tier because I guess I'm a little bit lower on him than I would be on any of the other Guardians as a potential pick. Viscera, despite having some very cool play lines in this format, does not really have the strength, I think, to take on the top contenders. Potentially in the future, I think he could, though, because that hero power is very strong and he has very efficient play lines. Vincent recently had some very good tournament success in this format, and I think that she's able to use the rune gates very well, and if she's able to keep the engine going, I think she can be a very powerful deck. So I can definitely see her being a very strong meta contender. And finally, to wrap it up with Zen, I just don't think he has what it takes right now. There was that build we tried out with the Hope Merchant's Hood and making the Tigers and shuffling them back in. Ultimately, it's just not really enough damage, and I don't think that the pen cards really move the needle on him too much. And so this tier list is really in no particular order. I think if I were to stress anything, though, probably the fact that I think Lexi is somewhere in between these two tiers, as well as potentially the Guardians, and then, the DGA decks, I think, are all somewhere in the middle here, as well as the Guardians. I just wanted to, I think, showcase the ones that I think are a little bit better than the rest. And so if I were going to a ProQuest this weekend, I think I'm instantly looking at the top 6 heroes as decks that I think have the highest likelihood to win, decks that I think will do very well, that will make top 8 very easily, and decks that I probably should consider playing or should at the very least be testing against and practicing with. If I find something that I think is a good meta angle into, that entire top cut here, that's where I think that you can have some really powerful success. And the category below, I think, are decks that I would fully expect to do well and potentially put up results in the leaderboard. I think would be pulling behind significantly compared to, those top 6 heroes. And then the bottom category, they're probably not. I think it's going to be a very difficult journey to do so. Not that it's impossible, but if you're going to play these heroes for this tournament circuit, I think it's going to require a lot of expertise on your end. You're going to need to have all your matchups nailed down super tight. And even then, you're going to be required to lean into a little bit of variance, have things work your way, both in gem pairings and the games themselves. And ultimately, I think you're cutting out a lot of work for yourself. And so once again, if my goal was to qualify for the Pro Tour, I would probably look at the heroes I think have the highest odds to win and just play the numbers game. But this is, of course, my opinion. Let me know what's been working for you and what you expect to do well this weekend. Until next time, thank you for watching.